shortly after coming to power, Hitler rails against the injustices of the Versailles Treaty. Now, of course, the treaty, as we know, limits the German army to 100,000 men, which again is seen as being enough that if Germany is invaded, the theory was, with the Treaty of Versailles, the theory was if a foreign power were to invade Germany, say the Soviets or whatever, the Poles or whatever, 100,000 men would be enough to slow down an invader long enough for Britain and France and America, theoretically, to come to its rescue. But the reality is, 100,000 men is not very big, particularly when you look at the size of armies during World War I, where you have these multi-million men armies. 100,000 men is really not very much. So Hitler begins to rail against that. Now, of course, the Germans were also denied the Great General Staff. They simply reconstitute it and rename it the Troop Office. Hitler, in 1935, is going to withdraw from the League of Nations. He is going to withdraw Germany from the League of Nations. And his reasoning for this is this limitation of the German military. He's saying Germany, because there was all that talk about arms reduction across the board. Remember, we have the Washington Naval Conference, and there's other conferences where people discuss the idea of other nations voluntarily limiting their armies and drawing them down. And so Hitler's saying, well, that never really happened. You guys never really limited your army. So if tomorrow everybody in the League of Nations agrees to have a 100,000-man army, okay, then we'll stay in the League. But otherwise it makes no sense for us to have these artificial limitations of our army while everybody else still has these massive armies. It's not fair, is what he's saying, essentially. Now, Hitler knows the other nations are not going to agree to this. He knows they're not going to go down to 100,000 men. So he's essentially, it's kind of an excuse, and which is not to say he doesn't have a point. He does, but he's being disingenuous when he says this, right? His plan is to increase the German military. So he withdraws from the League of Nations in October of 1933. In October of 1933. And essentially, I mean, he says to France specifically, because France was seen as being the major antagonist of the Germans, of course, in the First World War. He says, if Germany, or if France would cut its army to 100,000 men, or if it would allow Germany to have an army the size of the French army, then, you know, like I said, we can stay in. But France is not going to go for either of those things. France is still scared to death of Germany. Germany nearly destroyed France in World War I, and they're scared to death if Germany gets a bigger army, what they could do. So his plan all along, as soon as he comes to power, is to rearm Germany. His plan is to increase the size of the military. So he announces this in beginning in 1935, and they'd already started the process. But whenever people say, "Oh, Hitler's planning on war," he would kind of have this sanctimonious attitude. He's saying, "I'm just building a force large enough to defend my country. I'm just building a force large enough to defend my country. And I just want for the German people something else that every other European country enjoys: security, right? We want to enjoy our own security." Now, again, I mean, he's got a point here, but he's disingenuous about how he's going about it. So Hitler, actually, as soon as he comes to power, he starts quietly working with the army about plans to increase the size of the military. By early 1935, by about the time he announces this rearmament, the German army already had 280,000 men under arms. 280,000 men under arms. The General Staff, the Troop Office General Staff, they actually call for a peacetime army of about 30 to 36 divisions. About 30 to 36 divisions. Hitler agrees to further expansions. He agrees to further expansions. Now, the army at this time, remember, during the Weimar Republic, the army was known as the Reichswehr, like imperial defense, right? The Reichswehr. Now, they kind of rechristen the armed forces. The army itself, I should point out, the actual name for the army, the German word for army is Heer, H-E-E-R, Heer. But when we say Reichswehr, we're talking about the defense forces of the army. And now that word is kind of rechristened Wehrmacht. And this is what it's going to be called in the Second World War, the Wehrmacht. Defense force. That's literally what that means, is defense force, Wehrmacht. But then he also unveils something that had kind of long rumored to be the case, and that is Germany was working on a military air force. And this was, so he unveils this in 1935, and this is the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe. This literally means air weapons. Air weapons. The Luftwaffe. They have about, I think the Luftwaffe has about, I think about 800 planes by the time he announces it, something like 800 planes by the time he announces it. And again, there have been rumors that he was already working on that, but nothing concrete. When he announces the German rearmament here, the Proclamation of Military Sovereignty in 1935, when he announces that, he says, Germany, it is our intention to build an army of 500,000 men. He says, that is our intention, 500,000 men. That is an acceptable peacetime army, 500,000 men. But I will say, this is also part of a German tradition. After Napoleon conquered Prussia in 1806, he limited the size of the Prussian army. And so the Prussians, when they first create the general staff, is in the wake of this military defeat, and they, in secret, rebuild their army to fight Napoleon. So there's kind of a German tradition, a German history of this kind of building an army in secret. So again, he announces all of these moves, all of these ideas are purely defensive, right? In fact, the very name Wehrmacht, defense force, right? It's purely, he's talking in defense here. Now, here's the thing. France, Britain, and Italy, and Mussolini and Hitler were not on the same page in the first few years of the Nazi regime. They were not good friends in the first few years of the Nazi regime. In fact, in I think it was 22 or 23, I can't remember if I mentioned this before, Hitler actually wrote a letter to Mussolini. So this is about the time of the Beer Hall Putsch, I think just before the Beer Hall Putsch. He wrote a letter to Mussolini. He asked him for an autographed photograph. And Mussolini wrote back saying, request denied. Right? So Hitler and Mussolini, they're not really tight for the first few years of the Nazi regime here. So Britain, France, and Italy, they all are a little unsettled by this. This is Germany rebuilding its army is something that is kind of upsetting the equilibrium that was created, in the post-war order. Now, one of the things they're very scared of is that Germany would attempt to take over Austria. Now, at the very end of World War I, Austria, when it was being dismembered and it was being divested of Czechoslovakia and Transylvania and all these other places, the rump of Austria, which of course is ethnically German, they speak German, they had taken a vote to join Germany. They wanted to become part of Germany at the end of World War I. The Allies would not allow this because they don't want Germany to get bigger and more powerful when they just defeated it, right? So the Allies denied it. But there was a great fear that the Germans would attempt to take over Austria, and that maybe even the Austrians might be cool with it. So what they do is the Austrian government certainly would oppose that. And so these Britain, France, and Italy, they all announced their intention to protect Austrian sovereignty. They would protect Austrian sovereignty here. And this was known as the Streicher Front. The Streicher Front. You can see Mussolini and foreign ministers of France and Britain there. The Streicher Front. And so essentially they're attempting, Britain, France, and Italy are putting up a united front against the possibility of German aggression. Remember, Germany has not been aggressive yet. Some people are taking Hitler at his word. Like I say, he has a point. They don't know who he is yet. So they're saying, okay, we'll work together. However, this falls apart very, very quickly. The Streicher Front falls apart very, very quickly. Because not long after, a few months later, Italy invades Ethiopia. They invade Ethiopia. Now, in the 1890s, Italy had attempted to invade Ethiopia with modern rifles, with guns, and the native Ethiopians, without modern weapons, defeated the Italians. It was a huge embarrassment. So the Italians had always kind of felt like they wanted a little bit of revenge here. So Mussolini actually invades Ethiopia. This is widely condemned. The Italian invasion of Ethiopia is widely condemned. The Emperor Haile Selassie I think it's how you pronounce it, Haile Selassie, he actually goes before the League of Nations and condemns Italy, and he receives a lot of sympathy for it. And in Germany itself, most Germans greet the announcements of an expanded military with enthusiasm. They think, we're casting off these horrible restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. But some Germans are less than enthusiastic, as you can imagine, because they are scared this could potentially lead to war. So they're not too happy about it there. That's kind of Hitler's first big foreign policy announcement that really upsets people, that really starts getting people to think, okay, we may have a problem here. Well, things go from bad to worse for those people that are correct in thinking that. And that is because Hitler very quickly is going to make another move that's going to upset the international order. And this is going to have to do with the Rhineland. The Rhineland. So this territory here, roughly, is the Rhineland. This dotted area there is roughly the Rhineland. And the Rhineland is the part of Germany that shares its border with France and with the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands. As part of the Treaty of Versailles, one of the clauses stated Germany could not place any part of its military in this territory. Germany was forbidden to placing their military in this territory. This is why, in 1923, when the Germans got behind on their payments, the French were able to put in their military into the Rhineland to extract stuff, because Germany was not allowed to have any military units there with which to oppose any kind of an invasion. Now, also, too, the Rhineland really is the industrial heart of Germany. This is where these cities here are where you have Köln, Essen, Frankfurt. These are where you have, in the Rhineland, this is where you have your factories, your steel works, the Krupp works. The Krupp works were in Essen, I believe. So you have all of these factories. Germany's industry much of it is concentrated in this area. So this is an incredibly important part of Germany. Now, as I say, the French had demanded Germany could not have any military units in this area. Hitler, after his announcement in 1935 about the remilitarization, he goes ahead and he says, we need to reassert our authority in the Rhineland, and we need to, again, cast off this other hated Article of Versailles. So he turns to the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Werner von Fritsch, and we'll be talking about him later. He turns to the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, and he says, we need to drop a plan to invade the Rhineland. And by invade, again, this is not a foreign country. This is Germany. But you still need to do it like it's a military operation. Move in there like a military operation. Because you don't know what the French response is going to be. The Minister of War, von Blumberg, he is afraid the Germans wouldn't be able to stand up to if the French responded, if the French launched some kind of an attack there, that the Germans, the force they put into the Rhineland, would not be able to adequately defend itself. In fact, there was a fear that a single French division could push out the German force, because the German force isn't going to be that big. But Hitler insisted, this provision of the Treaty of Versailles that says we can't put our army on our territory needs to go. Now, some generals, German generals, later stated, had Hitler, or had the French responded, had the French actually moved against this German army, they would have removed Hitler. They would have moved against Hitler, removed him from power. But Hitler, his whole life, and his whole career, Hitler is a gambler, right? He's gambling that the French aren't going to do anything here, and he's right. On March 7th, 1936, he moves his troops into the Rhineland. He actually goes on the radio. He says, as I am speaking, German troops are moving into the Rhineland. He said, I will be willing to pull my troops back out if the French will also demilitarize roughly the same amount of territory on their side of the border as well. Again, he knows the French aren't going to do this. He knows the French aren't going to do this. And he's saying, I'm just trying to defend my borders the way the French are. How come I can't do that? And again, he's got a point. Again, he's got a point. Which is not to say he's ultimately right here. I'm not suggesting that. But there's, the greatest lies often have some kernel of truth to them, He stated at the time, after we occupy the Rhineland, I'm done. No more territorial demands in Europe. We're just going to take back the Rhineland, and then no more territorial demands in Europe. Will the French publicly protest what the Germans are doing? The League of Nations protests what he was doing, but nobody is willing to start a war over this. This is only 18 years, one generation after the end of World War I. Nobody wants another bloodbath. Nobody wants a bloodbath, so nobody's going to start another war. Ironically, as I say, had the French done something here, and the French have their own political problems. They got the biggest party in France at this time are the communists, and there's coalition trying to keep the communists in check, and we'd have to spend all this money we don't have, and there's all these political problems going on in France, so they kind of lack the political will to stop the Germans. If they had, I'm not a big fan of counterfactuals, but if the French had had the political will to stop Hitler here, maybe World War II never would have happened. Okay. So his bluff works, and of course this plays huge political dividends in Germany. The German people are thinking, this guy is great, right? He's showing the world we can't be pushed around, where his popularity goes through the roof, and France looks weak. Particularly, and this is important because France looks weak, and why that's significant here is your status as a power and your ability to work with other nations depends on how well those nations respect you. Some of France's key allies at this time are Poland and Czechoslovakia, which border Germany to the east. So when France looks weak, suddenly they're thinking, can we count on France? If crap gets real here, can we count on France? So it hurts France's position diplomatically and in Europe here. Thomas Childers, the historian, he wrote, quote, perhaps as important, the seizure of the Rhineland also further eroded the confidence of Germany's military commanders in their own judgment. Again, what that means is many of these army commanders actually thought Hitler was wrong. Hitler was going to get us into a war, and they're actually thinking maybe if the French move against him, we can remove Hitler to avoid a major war here. But the reality is, a lot of army officers start to second-guess themselves. You know what? Hitler was right about announcing rearmament. He's right about going into the Rhineland. Maybe this guy knows more than we thought he did. Maybe he understands the political situation in Europe better than we do. And truth be told, he did. Hitler was very clever when it came to like I say, he's a gambler. And he knows when the other guy's holding a losing hand. He's very good at that, at least in these early years. And consequently, the German army officers, they're not trained in diplomacy and in these kinds of things. And so Hitler's actually he's better at them in reading these foreign governments and what they're willing to do and what they're willing to not do. So the confidence of the German army, of the officer class, kind of diminishes, and they kind of take Hitler a little more seriously than they had. Hitler would later tell a crowd in Munich, quote, I go the way that Providence dictates with the assurance of a sleepwalker. I go the way that Providence dictates with the assurance of a sleepwalker. I make a decision, and I just follow it through, and events happen, and that's the way fate wills it, Now, 1936 is also important because Berlin hosts the Olympic Games. The largest stadium in the world at the time had been constructed for this event here, which is really cool. It's still there, and it's massive. And it holds about 100,000 people. The Germans one of the reasons why this is so significant is The Germans are trying to convince the world. They're trying to impress the world. And so what that means is, first of all, they try to show Berlin as much more of an international city in a lot of ways. Hitler and his ilk hated jazz music. They did not like American music at all. And yet during this time, they instruct German bands, play jazz. Play stuff that Americans like, that international people like. We'll show them we're tolerant and we're cosmopolitan in this sense. Many prostitutes that have been marginalized, have been rounded up or put in certain areas or in prison, they were told to go out and have at it. Make sure you take care of these bigwigs, these international bigwigs, right? They wanted people to have a good time while they were here. But one of the most important things that happens here during the few weeks of the Olympics are in Berlin, the Germans completely suspend public indications, public expressions of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism stops here for about 3 weeks or so. It stops. So you had all these signs all over Germany, not long after the Nazis come to power. They would put on park benches, they put in public restrooms, they put everywhere. It would say, for Juden verboten, for Jews forbidden. So Jews could not use these things. All these signs disappear during the Olympics. All these signs disappear during the Olympics. You had newspapers that were being sold throughout Germany that were, again, violently anti-Semitic. Julius Streicher's Der Stürmer was like practically this anti-Jewish pornographic magazine that always had these stories about these nefarious Jews raping German women and these sorts of things. All this anti-Semitic newspapers and stuff disappear from German newsstands. It all disappears from German newsstands. The press, which had on the radio, and like I said, newspapers had always been incredibly anti-Semitic, they just knock it off. For 2 weeks, nothing anti-Jewish here. Now, in the games, of course, Germany wins the most medals. And, of course, German propaganda plays this up to no end. They play this up to no end. So really, the Olympics are a public relations coup for the Nazis. Now, the Olympic Committee had decided to hold the Olympics here in Berlin before the Nazis came to power. After the Nazis came to power, there was a serious debate among the Olympic Committee, should we still hold the Olympics here? And ultimately they decided they would. They decided initially to hold it in Berlin because they wanted to help Berlin get back up on its feet, right? But there's this debate about whether we should hold it in Berlin after the Nazis come to power, and ultimately the committee decides that they'll go through with it, largely for economic reasons. They'd already spent a lot of money. But they decide, we'll hold it here. Of course, the 1940 Olympics were actually scheduled to be held in Tokyo. And Hitler said next year it was not long after this. They'd already scheduled the 1940 Olympics in Tokyo. And it was not long after the 36 Olympics, he said, the 1940 Olympics will be held in Tokyo, and thereafter, every Olympics will be held in Berlin. Of course, one of the big embarrassments, however, is Jesse Owens, of course, an African-American athlete. He won gold medals in track and field events, and it was kind of an embarrassment. And Hitler was supposed to go and shake the hands of all the athletes, and the day that Owens won his gold medals, he just left early and said, I have pressing business. As soon as the Olympics are over, all the anti-Semitism returns, all the repression returns, and it wasn't just anti-Semitic propaganda that took a holiday during the Olympics. It was also anti-communist rhetoric. There was still some anti-communism during the Olympics, but it was really toned down. That all comes back, of course, as soon as the Olympics are over. Now, something else occurs here in 1936 that's going to have some pretty big implications for Europe. And that is the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War. Now, what happens is in 1936, you have a very left-leaning government is elected. It's Not a communist government. It's not a Marxist government. But it is a socialist government. It is a socialist government. And this socialist government, they were fighting for the Republic because they were legally voted into power for the Republic. They call themselves Republicans. Okay, Republicans. A lot of people are not happy with this new government because the new government starts to put a lot of restrictions on the churches and other kind of traditional props of conservative Spain. So a lot of people are not happy. And of course, the army, just like in Germany, the army in Spain is a bastion of conservatism. So the army wants to fight here. The problem is the bulk of the Spanish army is not in Spain. It's in the Canary Islands, it's in North Africa, it's in all these kind of colonial possessions. One general here who absolutely opposes what's happening with the leftist government is Francisco Franco. Francisco Franco. And he's actually from this area where they kind of have that little bit of a lisp. So he's Francisco Franco. He was, I think, in the Canary Islands. I can't remember if he's in the Canary Islands or North Africa, but he's not in Spain. And anyway, the problem is he really wants to fight in Spain against these Republicans. The problem is he can't get his army there. All the ships, all the transport is in Spain. The Republicans are controlling it. He can't get his army back to Spain to fight. So Franco, in desperation, he sends a couple of his officers to Germany. And I can't remember, there's some festival, it may have been the Bayreuth Festival of Wagner, but Hitler is in the south of Germany in one of these festivals, and literally, these two Spanish officers just show up and spoke German, and they go to Hitler, they're saying to all the people, we're representatives of this Spanish general, please, we need to speak to Hitler. And anyway, they give him an audience. So Hitler has an audience with these two Spanish officers, and they say, we desperately need to get our army back to Spain. We desperately need to get our army back to Spain. And we need your help. And they say, we kind of believe in a lot of the same things you believe in, and we want a strong Spain, and we're authoritarian, we're right-wing. And so Hitler, on his own, without any consultation with either the German foreign secretary or the defense minister, he says, I'm going to give you and your people airplanes to fly your guys back to Spain, transport planes. And of course, Hitler informs both the foreign ministry and the war ministry, this is what we're doing, and of course they say, yes sir. And so you get a bunch of transport planes then ferry Francisco's men back into Spain where they can reconstitute as an army and they can fight. So the Spanish Civil War then really owes a lot to, first of all, the Germans for allowing the army to get back to Spain. And then Germans volunteer to fight in Spain. The Germans set up something called the Condor Legion. Now, when I say volunteer, you can bet many of these guys were ordered. Now, the Condor Legion itself was actually a Luftwaffe detachment. These are German airplanes. But you have many infantry soldiers also volunteer here. And they're not the only ones. A lot of different nations are sending volunteers. The United States sent volunteers here to fight for the Republicans. And they called themselves the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. But it was illegal. FDR said, if you go to fight for Spain, you'll lose your citizenship. So they took away a number of American citizenship when they fought in Spain. George Orwell in England, he went and he fought for the Republicans. He was no lover of communism, but he did believe there was something to socialism, and he hated these fascists. And so he goes and he fights in Spain, even though the British government does not officially get involved. Orwell fights. And Orwell wrote a great book called Homage to Catalonia. If you ever read it, it's a great book about his experiences in Spain. In fact, Orwell goes into this war almost being a Marxist. And he's so disgusted with the way the communists fight in this war and act in this war, he gets very disillusioned with communism. He goes on to write 1984 and Animal Farm, which are really critiques of communism. So these Germans fight. The Italians also send people to fight for Franco. You have a few people from the Soviet Union fight for the Republicans. But this war lasts for 3 years. Barcelona was the last Republican stronghold to fall to the nationalists, and Franco ultimately wins the war in 1939. And so Franco is very grateful to the Germans for helping him begin this war, but he's also grateful to the Germans for the volunteers and for the military assistance, and there was some economic assistance as well. And Hitler was very grateful because his army and his Air Force have practical experience. They gain practical experience in this war. So when World War II rolls around, they already, like I say, have experience. They already know kind of how these things are going down. Now, Franco is sometimes referred to as a fascist. I don't know that I would quite call him a fascist. I would call him more just kind of a traditional right-wing authoritarian figure. Paxton and even Bessel have some pretty strong definitions of what fascism is. And I don't know that he really falls into them in the way Italy does and the way Germany does. Because one of the big characteristics, according to Paxton, is you need to be willing to fight a war. Now, this was a civil war he kind of found himself thrust into. But when he was given the chance to join in World War II, he doesn't. Spain remains neutral in the war. Italy joins, and he says Italy had to join World War II to kind of shore up its legitimacy. That was the only way Mussolini could maintain his legitimacy. Franco didn't need to do that, so Franco's not technically fascist. Right-wing authoritarian for sure. But anyway, during the course of the war, approximately 16,000 German soldiers and airmen fought in Spain. 16,000 German soldiers and airmen fought in Spain, and about 300 of them died. About 300 Germans die fighting in Spain. Now, we have something very important, an event that is extremely important that occurs in November of 1937. By this point in 1937, you're having these huge bureaucratic battles between the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force over resources. They all need steel, they all need oil, and they're fighting each other over all these resources. It's kind of the same thing that the German Army or the Japanese Army and Navy are doing in Japan at this time. But the different services are fighting over resources. So essentially, in order to get all this sorted out, Hitler, remember, Hitler's lazy. He doesn't intervene. He just kind of lets people do their things. But Hitler finally says, okay, I need to get involved in this decision. I need to get involved here. All the people say, Hitler, we need you to adjudicate this. So Hitler agrees to a meeting on 5 November 1937. 5 November 1937. They meet at the Reich's Chancellery building. So these guys are who attends the meeting. Now, we call this the Hossbach Conference because Colonel Friedrich Hossbach was Hitler's military adjutant, and he's the guy that takes the minutes. He's the guy that records the minutes of this meeting. So that's why we call it the Hossbach Conference. He wrote a memorandum we refer to as the Hossbach Memorandum. This is the Hossbach Conference. You have Hermann Goering is here. Now, Hermann Goering is kind of an odd duck because on one hand, he is the head of the Luftwaffe, which is subordinate to the war minister. However, he actually technically outranks Blumberg, who's the defense minister. So it's kind of a weird thing there. But Hermann Goering is the head of the Luftwaffe, the head of the Air Force. You have Werner von Fritsch. Okay, Werner von Fritsch. Werner von Fritsch is the commander-in-chief of the Army. The commander-in-chief of the Army. Then you have Erich Raeder. Erich Raeder is an admiral. He is the commander-in-chief of the Navy. He's the commander-in-chief of the Navy. So you've got Air Force, Army, and Navy. Then you also have present Werner von Blumberg. Werner von Blumberg is the defense minister. So in theory, all three of these guys answer to von Blumberg, and von Blumberg answers to Hitler. Okay? So that's the chain of command. In theory, Goering, Fritsch, Raeder, they all answer to von Blumberg. Von Blumberg answers to Hitler. The reality is, they say, Goering is essentially the second in command of the Nazi Party. He's like the Prime Minister of Prussia. He wears all these hats. He has direct access to Hitler. So it's kind of a weird command structure here. But these are the guys that are attending. Has everybody got that there? Okay, so Hitler comes out, and instead of arbitrating this dispute over resources, Hitler states that, quote, the aim of German policy was to make secure and preserve the racial community and to enlarge it. To preserve the racial community and to enlarge it. He states that, let's see if I got it here. Yeah, he states that Germany needs Lebensraum. Lebensraum. What is Lebensraum? Living room, literally. Yeah, living space. Yeah. Essentially, we need more room to expand. Germany has this huge population. Now remember, Hitler's very much colored by the thinking of the late 19th century. This is why European states have colonies. This idea that we'll get too big. If we don't have colonies, we don't have places to put our people, we'll get too crowded, right? And our economy will collapse. We need living room to actually move. Hitler's still thinking in these terms. Germany today is about a third as big as it was under Hitler, and it's far more economically powerful than it was under Hitler. So that's a crap notion. You don't need geographic space here, but that is very much a 19th century idea. And Hitler in many ways is a 19th century politician. He understands technological progress, and he backs military innovators, but in a lot of ways, he's like a 19th century thinker here. So he gives a 3-hour monologue to these generals. He gives a 3-hour monologue to these generals. And he says, we need to acquire access to raw materials we do not currently have access to that we have to buy on the market. Especially we need oil, tin, rubber, and steel. We need access to oil, tin, rubber, and steel. These are things you need in order to have a war machine, a modern Army, Navy, Air Force. You need these things. Oil, tin, rubber, and steel. Food is another major resource that Germany needs more of. Now remember, in World War I, Britain had that blockade. 750,000 Germans starved to death because of lack of food. Germany needs access to more farms, more food. So he says because of this, all of these resources that we need are found in Eastern Europe and Russia. We need all of these resources in Eastern Europe and Russia. We can find all of them there. Therefore, Germany needs to move eastward if it is going to fulfill its historic destiny. Germany has got to move eastward if it is going to fulfill its historic destiny. He said, quote, Germany's problem could only be solved by force, and this was never without the attendant risk. The only real question was when and how. This is Childers who's saying that. Germany's problem could only be solved by force, and this was never without attendant risk. The only real question was when and how. This idea of gaining resources and economic self-sufficiency, this is what Hitler wants for Germany. Economic self-sufficiency. This is the exact same thing the Japanese are going to want in the Pacific that's going to cause them to start their war in the Pacific. This idea of economic self-sufficiency, we can call this autarky. Autarky. Economic self-sufficiency. So Hitler is saying he wants Lebensraum, living space in the East, and autarky. Economic self-sufficiency. Economic self-sufficiency. Now, here's the thing. We can't just, boom, tomorrow, wage war against Russia. First of all, in 1937, we're not economically ready for it. We're not economically ready for a war. But also, too, we've got all these other spaces around Germany that maybe we need to move into. Austria. We want to incorporate Austria into the Reich. We could probably do this bloodlessly because so many Austrians actually like the idea of joining Germany. But we're going to have to go, sooner or later, we're going to have to go into Czechoslovakia. And the Czechs will put up a fight. The Czechs are not ethnically German. They will put up a fight. If they put up a fight, will the French come in? So the Czechs will probably fight. Well, we may have a fight there. And then, of course, we don't know about Poland. We don't know exactly how Poland's going to go down. He says, don't worry too much about Britain. Britain's not nearly as powerful as it projects itself to be. Britain isn't as powerful. Britain's an empire on the decline. We shouldn't worry too much about Britain. And France won't go to war with us unless Britain's helping it. France is timid. France won't go to war either. So he's saying essentially, if we have to, we can fight a bunch of wars. And Hitler is not seeing in his head this idea of, I'm going to start a world war. Hitler's idea is, I'm going to start a war against Czechoslovakia, and I'll win it. I'll go into Austria. If I have to fight a war, I will, but I probably won't have to. I'll go into Poland, and I'll win it. Then, once we're in a position, or our economy's humming, we'll go to war against the Soviet Union. So Hitler sees a series of short, sharp wars. He doesn't see this big, massive war. He really doesn't expect to go to war with Britain and France. He sees these wars in Central and Eastern Europe as very quick wars that he will win very, very quickly, and he'll be able to move eastward from there. He also believed that if he goes into Austria, the Italians, of course, had an interest in... They saw Austria as kind of in their sphere of influence. And Hitler, there was some fear, if we go into Austria, or the Italians going to be upset by that. Hitler was convinced he could come to some kind of modus vivendi with Mussolini. He and Mussolini kind of spoke the same language. He was convinced that the Italians, he could buy them off somehow. He wasn't too worried about the Italians there. Now, of course, as soon as he announces this plan, Goering, oh, yes, great idea. I mean, Goering was the perfect yes man. I mean, Goering's, oh, this is so brilliant. But the other generals, they're kind of more hesitant. They're kind of reticent here. They don't necessarily have a problem with the idea of gaining Lebensraum. They certainly were anti-communists, so they didn't have any problem with going against Russia. But they're very skeptical of Hitler's claim that Britain and France will stay neutral. They're very, very skeptical of that claim that they will stay neutral. And they're very afraid that if they embark on this plan to conquer Eastern Europe, they're very afraid that if they embark on this plan to conquer Eastern Europe, that Britain and France will get involved, and that they will be much more powerful than Hitler is making them out to be here. Hitler's conception of these wars, these short, sharp wars he's going to fight, is he kind of sees himself in a way as a modern Bismarck. Because in the 1860s, Bismarck, Germany, you know, at the beginning of the 1860s was different countries, right? It was about about 30 different little countries. And Hitler, or Bismarck rather, launches 3 wars of unification. One in 1864, one in 1866, and one in 1870-71, that are these 3 short, sharp wars that essentially created Germany. Hitler kind of sees himself doing the same thing with these wars. But this meeting is critical, because this is the first time Hitler openly tells his people, we are going to war for sure, and this is how we're going to do it, and this is why we're going to do it. Okay, now we get into the down and dirty stuff here of German sex scandals. We're going to have something now, just a few months later, a few months after the Hossbach conference, called the Blomberg-Fritsch affair. Blomberg-Fritsch affair. Now, Werner von Blomberg, the Minister of War, there on the right, he was a widow. He was a widow. And one day, he goes to Hitler, and he says, Mein Führer, I'm in love. There's this woman I'm in love with. I want to marry her. But there's a problem. She is 35, or pardon me, she was about 30, so, no, she was in her late 20s. She was 35 years younger than him, okay? She was 35 years younger than him. Now, that's not such a big deal. Throughout European history, it's not uncommon for older men to marry younger women. It's not uncommon. The problem was this. Werner von Blomberg, he's a von. He's an aristocrat. He is from this noble Prussian family. He is, you know, the premier military officer of the country. He has a lot of prestige. The army is granting him a lot of respect. And the problem is, this woman he wants to marry was his secretary. She came from very, very humble origins. She was poor. She came from a poor family. She was not noble, not even respected upper class. She was lower middle class, right? Lower middle class. And Blomberg knows the rest of the officers would not approve. Just the class differences were too great. It's unseemly for a man of von Blomberg's standing to marry a woman who is so low born. And this is real. This is German conservatism as it existed at the time, right? Someone high-born like that does not marry someone low-born. It just doesn't happen. But he's in love, and he wants to marry her. So he goes to Hitler and he asks Hitler for permission. And what does Hitler say? Yes! This is fantastic! Because Hitler says, look at what we're doing. We are tearing down these class walls, these class barriers. We're tearing these things down. So Hitler is delighted. Hitler is absolutely delighted. So Hitler thinks this is a great idea. Okay? Hitler thinks this is awesome because, again, it breaks down class barriers. In Hitler's Germany, it doesn't matter if you're an aristocrat, it doesn't matter if you're lowborn, we can cross these boundaries. These don't have the same meanings that they had traditionally had in German society. Hitler thinks this is a great thing. So not only does Hitler give his permission, Hitler insists on attending the wedding and being a witness at the wedding. He wants this to be a big public display of the new Germany. So Hitler and Goering both attend the wedding. They serve as witnesses. They sign the register. Hitler kisses the bride's hand. And then von Blumberg and his bride go to take like a 2 or 3 month honeymoon. They go to the Dutch East Indies. They go to different places. And not long after von Blumberg and his bride leave to go on this honeymoon, the Gestapo says to Hitler, we need to talk to you about something. We just found out. It turned out that von Blumberg's bride, before she was a secretary, she'd had a different profession, sometimes referred to as the oldest profession. Yeah. And there were also photographs of her in compromising positions. And supposedly when one Gestapo agent saw this, he said, my God, the Fuhrer kissed her hand. And so this was a big deal. And of course, Hitler is really upset about this. So Hitler immediately sends a message to von Blumberg, and he says, look, you screwed up here big time. And if you divorce her, return to your post right now, we'll forgive it. Now remember, because Hitler was always very sentimental. And von Blumberg had supported him during the Rom purge, and so he feels some kind of like he owes von Blumberg something. So he says, if you divorce this woman, or you get this wedding annulled, come back here, resume your post immediately, all's forgiven. And von Blumberg said, no, I'd rather stay married. So Hitler, of course, is livid that this officer turned him down. So he resigns. Von Blumberg resigns. Most of the army officers were absolutely disgusted with von Blumberg, so it's very kind of disrespectful, or very dishonorable, what happened to him. Well, okay, so that's von Blumberg. Now, very quickly after von Blumberg, after all this comes out of von Blumberg, something else happens here regarding von Fritsch here in the Senate. Von Fritsch, one day, not long after here, the Gestapo... Now, I should point out, too, the Gestapo, Heinrich Himmler, probably knew this woman that married von Blumberg, probably knew she was a prostitute before they got married. He deliberately was trying to get this guy out of the way, right? This was dirty tricks, the standard practice for the Gestapo here. Well, a few weeks later, the Gestapo goes to Hitler, and they say, we found something about von Fritsch. Von Fritsch was in a train station at Wannsee, which is kind of a suburb of Berlin. And we found him at Wannsee in this train station. We have a report from a guy who claims that in a restroom, von Fritsch essentially propositioned her. Von Fritsch was a bachelor, a lifelong bachelor. And of course, the assumption with any lifelong bachelor is, well, they're gay, right? And of course, it's not something you speak about politely at the time, but that's always this kind of unspoken assumption. But here you have somebody testifying that von Fritsch essentially propositioned in this bathroom in a train station. Well, they go to von Fritsch, and they say, "Is this true?" And he says, "Absolutely not." And he's very upset, and he's very angry that his honor is being called into question this way. So Hitler and the the Gestapo, they conduct an investigation here, and Hitler, as we're going to see, is already beginning to mobilize the army for the invasion of Austria. Well, he kind of can't be dealing with this while he's trying to get that ready. So he essentially removes von Fritzsche as commander-in-chief of the army. He removes von Fritzsche as commander-in-chief of the army, but he doesn't dismiss him from the service or anything, because von Fritzsche had denied it. Von Fritzsche, after he's dismissed as commander-in-chief of the army, he demands a court-martial. He says, you must court-martial me because you need to prove these allegations. I was wrongly removed from this position. So they hold a court-martial, and what the court-martial finds is it was a case of mistaken identity. The man who claimed that von Fritzsche propositioned him actually had been propositioned by another army officer who had a similar name. And so this did not happen. The Gestapo, however, again, Himmler was probably working to get him out of the way. They were trying to get. They were actively trying to ignore that. I think they had known this was a case of false identity, and they kind of tried to ignore that, sweep that under the rug, because they're trying to eliminate him. But they succeed in getting him out of that post. Okay. In fact, von Fritzsche will go back to commanding troops, and his honor is stained. Even though he was proven that this was not the case, people still look at him funny, still, question his manliness and whatnot, and he has a hard time with it. And so when World War II breaks out, he's commanding an artillery unit in Poland, and he was looking to die. He exposed himself to enemy fire, and he was killed on the battlefield, so he had an honorable death at battle right at the beginning of World War II. Most army officers, as I say, they think getting rid of von Blumberg was right. He dishonored the army. He acted dishonorably. He was a fool. But most army officers thereafter thought von Fritzsche got a raw deal. That he absolutely got a raw deal. That the Nazis had ousted him for political reasons. Okay. So in the wake of these two guys, these very important guys, the war minister and the commander-in-chief of the army being removed, you've got to figure out, okay, so how are we going to do this? And this leads to a very important shakeup in the army, and also in kind of the Foreign Office will also be shaken up here as well. Hermann Goering wanted to be war minister. Hermann Goering wanted to be war minister. And it's entirely possible he was in on trying to get rid of these guys. So Hermann Goering really puts himself out there to Hitler as the logical successor to von Blumberg here. But the thing of it is, Joseph Goebbels doesn't want Goering to become any more powerful. So you can start to see this infighting and this backstabbing that's going on in the Nazi regime. Joseph Goebbels does not want Goering to become any more powerful. So Goebbels says to Hitler, mein Führer, nobody could have direct command over the armed forces. No one could exercise that more judiciously, more intelligently than you. So he puts the idea into Hitler's mind, maybe you should be both Führer, right, Chancellor and President, and Defense Minister at the same time. Now this is not, and that's exactly what Hitler will do. Hitler himself will take on the role of Defense Minister. This is not terribly uncommon, particularly when World War II starts. Winston Churchill, he'll be Prime Minister of the UK, he will also be the British Defense Minister, and Stalin, who is the head of the Soviet government, he actually doesn't become the head of the Soviet government until right before Hitler invades. He was just the head of the party, even though he ran the country. He will also become the defense minister of Russia, the Soviet Union. So that's not terribly uncommon to have your head of government also have a cabinet post as important as Minister of Defense. But, first of all, I'll get back to the military. The Foreign Office, we see a shakeup. Now, throughout Hitler's reign until 1938, his foreign minister had been this guy, Konstantin von Neurath. Konstantin von Neurath was conservative. He was not a Nazi. He was a conservative. He's one of the, again, he was the foreign secretary when Hitler came in and he wasn't allowed to have a lot of Nazis in government. Konstantin von Neurath was his foreign minister. He had increasingly, I think he became a Nazi eventually. He started wearing a swastika. But by this point, Hitler never really liked or trusted von Neurath. He never thought von Neurath was really committed to National Socialism the way some of these other guys were. So in the wake of all this stuff, he fires von Neurath, and he brings in this guy here, Joachim von Ribbentrop. Joachim von Ribbentrop. Von Ribbentrop was an old-school Nazi, and Hitler liked him a lot for several reasons, not the least of which Hitler thought he understood the British. He thought he understood the British. Von Ribbentrop, prior to World War I, had actually traveled in North America. He spent a lot of time in Canada, so he spoke fluent English. He had he'd been a wine salesman, so he made international contacts throughout Europe. However, I can't remember the exact circumstances. He was not a von. He was not an aristocrat. He found a distant aunt and essentially paid her to adopt him so that he could add a title to his name. Okay, so which is a very un-Nazi thing to do, but he wants the title. So Joachim von Ribbentrop, and this guy, the thing of it is, like I say, Hitler thought a lot of him. He's an old fighter. He'd been with the party for a long time. As I say, Hitler thought he was an expert on the British. The fact of the matter was, he was an idiot. Every other Nazi thought he was one of the stupidest guys. Like he and Alfred Rosenberg, all the other Nazis thought these were the two stupidest guys in the regime, right? They really think Rosenberg's an idiot. Ribbentrop's an idiot here. And Ribbentrop, before he's recalled to become the new foreign minister, he had actually been the German ambassador to England. He'd been the German ambassador to England. And he'd made a hash of it. When George the Sixth was I think it was when George the Sixth was coronated, he went to the coronation. He was the official German representative to the coronation of George the Sixth. And at the coronation, when everybody's cheering George the Sixth and his coronation, singing "God Save the King," what does von Ribbentrop do? How does he show his enthusiasm? What does he do? He does this. As you can imagine, the British don't think too much of that, right? So the guy's an idiot. And then when they questioned him at Nuremberg, he was just not too bright. Anyway, and you can see he's wearing an SS uniform. He held the rank of general in the SS. The SS, and I didn't really get into like how the SS was organized. You have different units within the SS. One of them was called the General SS, and everybody could belong to the General SS, which is just kind of more of a club than anything else, and that's what he was a part of. But he actually held the rank of general within the General SS, and so he liked to wear his SS uniform constantly. And Himmler liked him to wear it because it kind of showed that Himmler was his superior. So anyway, now back to the army. Hitler decides, okay, we're going to shake things up here. The High Command of the Army, which is Oberkommando der Heers, I guess I don't have it on here. So the Oberkommando der Heers was OKH. Okay, OKH. This is the Oberkommando der Heers, High Command of the Army. Well, when Hitler makes himself defense minister, he essentially creates kind of a military staff to help him with military matters. And that military staff was called the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, High Command of the Defense Forces. So these are two different institutions. In theory, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht is kind of over the High Command of the Army, in theory. Because this is kind of Hitler's personal military staff. Okay? Whereas the Army still has the Great General Staff. And they pride themselves on, the Great General Staff, which has been around since the Napoleonic Wars. Well, he appoints as the Chief of Staff of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Wilhelm Keitel. Wilhelm Keitel. Now, speaking of idiots, Wilhelm Keitel was an idiot. He is a military idiot. His virtue is, again, he's a yes man. He does whatever Hitler says. He actually came up through the artillery, and Hitler was at an exercise one day, and Hitler was asking Keitel questions about the artillery pieces. And Keitel didn't know anything. Hitler knew more about the artillery than Keitel did. And later, when it was over, Hitler was like joking with some of the other officers. Can you believe it? This guy came up through the artillery and he doesn't even know this stuff? So Keitel was a guy that, again, Hitler liked because he did whatever Hitler told him, but he's not one of the more competent army officers. Now, they appoint as the head of the operations, and this stuff's going to be important when we get into World War II. His head of the operations, the guy that actually really, really runs it, who is smart, is this guy here, Alfred Jodl. Alfred Jodl. He'll be the operations officer for the Oberkommandeur der Wehrmacht. And there's kind of a competition in Germany because the Oberkommandeur der Wehrmacht Alfred Jodl realized, in a modern war, we need a streamlined command structure for Army, Navy, Air Force. We need a streamlined command structure. But the Army does not want to surrender any of its sovereignty to something like OKW. Now, as I say, that's going to come into play when we get into the World War. So Hitler takes over from von Blumberg, but you still need a new commander-in-chief of the Army, head of the Oberkommandeur der Heer. And this is why I can't believe I don't have this slide. I thought for sure I made this slide. There's a guy named... Probably going to misspell his last name. Yeah, I'm not spelling that right. Walter von Brauchitsch. Okay, Walter von Brauchitsch. And Walter von Brauchitsch, he will be the commander-in-chief of the army. Now again, you need to remember this because when we get into World War II, there's going to be some pretty important things that go on with the way the army and the military are organized, okay? And particularly how it relates to the regime and how it relates to Hitler. So Austria here, as you can see, Austria is right down here, and this is Germany proper, East Prussia, and Austria is right down there. It looks like a chicken leg, right? As the Bromberg-Fritsch affair is playing out here in early 1938, Hitler is increasingly putting pressure on Vienna. Now, the Austrian government is led by the Austrian Chancellor, and his name is Kurt von Schuschnigg. Kurt von Schuschnigg. He's the Austrian Chancellor. Now, what you need to know is by this point, the Austrian government under von Schuschnigg is it's a right-wing authoritarian system. It's almost fascist. I wouldn't say it's fascist, but it's, kind of like Francisco in Spain. The Austrian government, they would salute each other by doing this. They wouldn't say Heil Hitler, of course, but they would make the symbol when they salute each other. I went and saw a production of Sound of Music, and like they do this where the Austrians start doing this, like it's this big ominous thing. It's like, well, they were already doing that, Schuschnigg, Hitler is trying to interfere with the internal government structure. He's trying to get Nazis placed in positions of power within the Austrian government, and Kurt von Schuschnigg is not happy about it. Germany and Austria had signed a treaty in 1936 respecting each other's sovereignty, and now Hitler appears to be not agreeing to that. So in early 1938, February of 1938, Hitler invites Schuschnigg to come to the Obersalzberg, which is like right here, which is Hitler's kind of vacation home. He says, why don't you come here, we'll talk about these issues and get everything resolved. Well, so Kurt Schuschnigg expects this to be a regular diplomatic meeting. We're going to work out our differences here. But what happens is when Schuschnigg gets there, Hitler had ordered all of his top generals there. So Hitler looks like he's going to war over this. He's here to intimidate von Schuschnigg. Hitler said, quote, he's yelling at von Schuschnigg, and he says, quote, the whole history of Austria is just one uninterrupted act of treason, and I am determined to put an end to all of this. When Schuschnigg says, we will oppose you by military force if you try to come in, Hitler said, you don't seriously believe you can hold me up for half an hour, do you? One of Hitler's biggest demands is he is saying, you need to appoint as Minister of the Interior this guy, Arthur Seyss-Inquart. Arthur Seyss-Inquart. Seyss-Inquart was an Austrian Nazi. He was a member of the Austrian Nazi Party. So Hitler's trying to get this Nazi put into power here in Austria. There are other demands that he's making. And Ribbentrop was there. He told Schuschnigg, the demands are non-negotiable. You do these things, or there's going to be a war. Schuschnigg goes back to Vienna. He's shaken. He's given a time limit, and Schuschnigg says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put it to the Austrian people. So he announces plans that on March 13th, 1938, on March 13th, 1938, there would be a plebiscite. Plebiscite, a yes-no vote. And he essentially says, the vote was, should Austria remain a free and independent German and Christian Austria? Meaning, should we remain an independent state, or should we surrender our sovereignty to the Nazis? Well, 2 days before the vote, on March 11th, 1938, the Nazis tell Schuschnigg, you need to postpone the vote. We'll tell you when you can hold the vote. The Nazis don't want to take any chances of them voting against it. The Austrians refuse, and the next day, March 12th, the German army moves into Austria. German motorized divisions, this is on March 12th, motorized divisions, so these are infantry and trucks, some tanks, they move through the Austrian border, and there is no resistance. This is not the Blitzkrieg. This is just literally German soldiers in trucks going along Austrian roads, and German officials or Austrian officials just kind of standing aside and letting them do that. Many German units didn't have up-to-date maps, so they weren't quite sure where they were going. A lot of the German tanks actually just stopped at commercial gas stations and filled up on diesel. You had a lot of vehicles break down, German vehicles break down. The biggest problem was German military traffic. They're having a hard time directing everybody. Okay, I mean, it's just gridlock, right? So the Germans are actually learning lessons about an invasion. They're learning lessons about how to invade a country here. But this is referred to as the Anschluss. This is referred to as the Anschluss. The Anschluss means unification. Unification. Bringing together of Germany and Austria, the unification here. Occurs on March 12th, 1938. You can see Hitler here with Seyss-Inquart. And what you have, let's see, do I have it up here? No, I guess I don't have it up here. What you have, and we're going to be talking a lot about these groups more, but you have something go into Austria here behind the German army called the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen. We're going to talk a lot about the Einsatzgruppen when we get to the Holocaust. But Einsatzgruppen, this literally means special action groups. Special action groups. And their job when they go in is to, they like raid for, it's run by the SD under the command of Heinrich Himmler and a general named Walter Schellenberg. They actually go into, like, they're tasked with special tasks like going into the Austrian intelligence division and raiding all their files, right? So they've got these special missions that they're carrying out. They're going to have much more nefarious missions in Russia a few years later. So this is kind of a peaceful invasion, right? It's kind of a peaceful invasion of Austria here. Now, on March 13th, the next day, Hitler goes to Austria. He travels by car into Austria. He briefly visits Braunau am Inn, where he was born, and just kind of looks around for a bit. It's kind of a little propaganda thing, local boy makes good, comes home, Then he moves to Linz. He goes on to Linz. He spent a lot of time as a child in Linz. In fact, Hitler would later state that his intention, when Greater Germania was complete after the end of the Second World War, he was going to make Linz kind of the cultural mecca of the new Germany. He was going to make that place where I think he wanted to be interned in Linz, is what he said. But everywhere he goes, people are cheering him. They're waving Nazi banners. Austrians appear just delighted with the way things played out. In fact, when he goes to Linz, it's a crowd of something like 100,000 people come out to cheer him in Linz. He also, while he was in Linz, he visits the graves of his parents. Both his parents were buried there. He visits their graves. And then he goes on to Vienna, of course, where he had also spent a lot of time. Bless you. And when he goes to Vienna, There's about 200,000 Austrians come out and cheer for him. And when he gets there, he makes a speech, he addresses them, he says, quote, "The oldest eastern province of the German Empire shall be from now on the youngest bulwark of the German nation. I can in this hour report before history the conclusion of the greatest aim of my life, the entry of my homeland into the German Reich." Now, Hitler's intention when he first, and this again, he's gambling. He doesn't know how this is going to play out. When he goes into Austria, his intention was, I will set up a puppet government. Austria will still be independent. The intention was not to create the Anschluss, the Union. The intention was to create a puppet government that he could control. But it is seeing all of these people come out and cheer him so enthusiastically that convinces him they actually do want to be incorporated into the Reich. They do want to become a province of the Reich. So he decides, while he's there, we're going to just annex Austria outright. We're just going to annex Austria outright. And so this is the Anschluss. This is the unification. Now, in April, a month later, the Nazis hold their own plebiscite. Now remember, Schuschnigg wanted to hold a plebiscite to say, should Austria remain neutral, right? Or independent, rather. Should Austria remain independent? And Hitler invades Austria before that plebiscite can take place. So, in April, the Nazis have their own plebiscite with the Austrians. Will you accept unification with Germany? Will you accept unification with Germany? What percentage of Austrians do you think voted to accept unification with Germany? 99%. 99%. The only time I remember a vote ever being 100% was when Saddam Hussein ran for president. Now here's the thing. Very quickly, the Nazis start moving their security apparatus, the Gestapo, the SD. They move these units into Austria and start taking over. 60,000 Austrians are arrested within days. 60,000 Austrians, including Schuschnigg. Kurt von Schuschnigg, the chancellor, he is arrested as well. He's going to be, whenever the Nazis take some of these kind of high-ranking public officials, they'll send them to concentration camps, but a lot of times they will give like special treatment. They're not like beaten like the other guys. They're just held, but they're not as mistreated as other inmates. I think in Sachsenhausen they actually had a mini camp within Sachsenhausen for some of these like high-ranking foreign officials. And I think Schuschnigg goes there actually, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong, but I think he does. Himmler, very quickly, he sets up a concentration camp near Linz called Mauthausen. So he sets up a concentration camp near Linz. And then, of course, as you can imagine, almost immediately the Jews become targets of these Nazi attacks. And really, what they are doing is, of course, the Jews had it much better in Austria than they'd had it in Germany the last few years. But even the Jews have not been treated amazingly in Austria. But this is just they're not used to this. As you can see here, you have Jews scrubbing the streets, cleaning the streets. That they're forced to do things like this. They're forced to clean toilets. And these people are standing around laughing at them, making sure they do this. And it's a way for the Nazis to say, first of all, to the Jews, you do what we tell you or else. But it's also a way to tell the other Austrians, this is how we do things. You're part of Germany now. We're on top, they're on the bottom, get on board with it. Right? But of course, the Jews are just horribly, horribly, horribly mistreated. Many Jews are beaten in public. Sometimes Nazis will break into their homes, steal things, and beat them. And many Jews are arrested and taken to concentration camps. And you're seeing much greater. This is kind of this like real sudden burst of anti-Semitism. Where this kind of more you're almost getting used to it in the Reich, in a sense, and this is just kind of a shock to the Austrians. Not that they necessarily, most German Austrians disagree with this, but they're perhaps not used to this level of violence, just almost casual violence that the Nazis kind of invoke here. So many Jews, as soon as they can, they get out of Austria. They leave Austria as fast as they can. This is not a good time to be a Jew in Austria. Perhaps as many as 1,000 Jews in Vienna. As many as 1,000 Jews in Vienna commit suicide. They'd rather die than live under the Nazis. Yeah. So, and we'll discuss this more when we actually get into the kind of the machinery of the Holocaust. But one of the things that the Nazis do is they strongly encourage emigration. They want you to leave, but they don't want you to take your wealth with you. You're only allowed to take very little money with you, and so frequently, when you would go past the border guards would say, "Yeah, okay, you can leave, but you'd either have to bribe them just to take your possessions with you, or they'll just take everything from you." I mean, again, and again, if I haven't made this point strong enough, let me make it again. Any totalitarian regime, and certainly the Nazi regime, is just corrupt to the core. It's just corrupt to the core. Because there's no accountability. If you mistreat Jews, if you steal from Jews, who cares? Who cares? Now, the government would care if you stole from a Jew that the government had decided that was the government's property. Like when you're in the camps, and the Jews would have watches and stuff, and they put them in these piles. If you were a guard and you stole something, you're stealing from the state, right? It's not that you're stealing from the Jews, you're stealing from the state. So that would be a problem. But yeah, these people are frequently taken advantage of, left and right, and there's no accountability, so yeah, they get their stuff taken from. By about a year later, they're not too happy, and most Austrians. And they're not too happy because Austria, or Vienna rather, had been a Weltstadt, a world city. Everybody around the world knew about Vienna. They came to Vienna. It was a cultural center. Vienna was a major, major city. And now under the Nazis, it kind of becomes a backwater. Under the Nazis, it's not as important a city as it had been historically. So the Viennese are not too happy because they almost kind of feel like their main city, Vienna, it's been downgraded, and it's not as important in the German Reich. And I mean, realistically, in any circumstances, it couldn't have been, right? If your country is subsumed into a much, much bigger country, you're not going to have the same status. Has everybody seen Schindler's List? But the main Nazi in that film is played by Ralph Fiennes, the British actor Ralph Fiennes, and he's an actual person. His name is Amon Goeth. Well, the film's in English, right? The film is shot in English. When they actually take it to Europe, into Germany and Austria, they translate it. Of course, it's dubbed, right? The actor that dubbed the voice for Amon Goeth had a Viennese accent. And a lot of Austrians initially were just really upset. How dare you kind of besmirch us by showing us just this nasty, evil, murderous Nazi, and here you're saying he's an Austrian. Of course, nobody looked up a history book. Amon Goeth was Austrian. He was from Vienna, right? And so it's even today these history's still it's still a battleground there. Yeah. Great film. You need to see it. Seriously, make that a point to see that. All right, so we have this next crisis or other that pops up, and this has to do with Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia. Now, Czechoslovakia, as we know, this was a country that is, at this point, not even 20 years old, right? Czechoslovakia was created by the Treaty of Versailles. It was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's a country that is made up of two predominant ethnic groups, the Czechs in the west and the Slovaks in the east. And the framers of the Treaty of Versailles thought it'd be a good idea. Hey, let's just throw these guys into one country. And there was some ethnic tension between the Czechs and the Slovaks. They didn't always get along so well. But by and large, this is really, despite that, Czechoslovakia had been one of the great success stories of the Treaty of Versailles, because this is, for all of its problems, a stable, working democracy. This is a stable, working democracy in Eastern Europe. Even Poland is going to get like a quasi-fascist government in the 30s. But Czechoslovakia remains a like I say, a viable democracy. The Sudetenland is this mountainous territory that is has a sizable number of ethnic Germans live in this territory. Sizable number of ethnic Germans. It is still predominantly Czech. The majority of people are Czech, but there is a significant German minority in these regions. There's a significant German minority in this region. Well, not long after the Nazis came to power in Germany, you have kind of an indigenous Nazi party, Czech Nazi party, pop up here, but it's made of ethnic Germans. And its leader was Konrad Henlein. And essentially, almost since 1933-34, Henlein had been agitating this territory needs to be returned to Germany. It needs to be returned to Germany. Now, why the framers chose the borders they did is because the Sudetenland, because it is mountainous, it actually gives a natural defensive position to the Czechs against Germany. It gives a defensive position there. Well, the NSDAP in Germany had actually been funding Henlein's movement for years. Okay? So they're behind it. They're pulling the strings. The NSDAP had been behind this. In May of 1938, so just, really quickly here after Austria, Hitler starts making noises that the German minority in Czechoslovakia is being mistreated, and if this territory is not returned to Germany, is not given to Germany, Germany will invade. So over the course of that summer of 1938, there's a lot of agitation. Now, I want to be very clear here. There was some anti-German violence in the Sudetenland. There were instances of Czechs going after Germans. This really doesn't heat up, though. You don't see a lot of this until after Hitler's threatening to invade. So that's when it really picks up. But there are some cases where Germans in Czechoslovakia are assaulted on the street. Nothing like what's happening with the Jews in Germany. But still, you do have some people being assaulted, beat up, some ethnic Germans. There was one case where there was this German who was a professor, and he, in a Czech university, he was a professor in a Czech university. And he's an older guy, and he had some issues where he had to go to the bathroom. He had a bad stomach, he had to keep going to the bathroom. Well, the students thought, these Czech students thought that he was screwing with them, that he was toying with them, that he would keep leaving and interrupting, and he kind of thought he was making fun of them, right? And so his students actually beat him to death. Okay? So there is some anti-German violence going on, okay? But it is relatively few and far between. Nothing that certainly couldn't be adjudicated by the courts, and was being adjudicated by the courts in Czechoslovakia. But Hitler's blowing this up, and Goebbels with his propaganda is blowing this up, acting like this kind of like the kind of violence the Nazis are visiting on the Jews, these Czechs are visiting on ethnic Germans. And there was nothing to that level that was going on, right? Well, now this is a very important and delicate and potentially internationally explosive matter, because Czechoslovakia is an ally of France. France and Czechoslovakia have an alliance. And really, this is because the French are terrified of Germany. They've been terrified of Germany even before World War I, they were terrified of Germany. They nearly lost World War I. They barely hung on in World War I. They're scared to death that Germany will come back because Germany's got a bigger population. It's got a bigger industrial base. They're terrified of Germany. So really, they're looking, and they've got an alliance with Poland. They've got an alliance with Czechoslovakia. They're looking to kind of hem Germany in. So if Germany is going to go to a war, it's got to know it's going to be fighting a two-front war, right? That's what the French foreign policy is doing. In like May, in the early part of the summer, when Hitler says, I may invade, Britain and France sound really tough, and they say, well, you invade, there's going to be a war. So Hitler kind of backs off from that. Hitler kind of stands down from that. But a little bit later that year, he tells his closest associates, it is my unshakable will to wipe Czechoslovakia off the map. Now, one of the reasons, now certainly Hitler has these expansionist, irredentist, pan-Germanist ideas for taking Czechoslovakia, right? He's a pan-German. Germany is wherever German is spoken. So there's a lot of that. But there's also, too, this absolute hatred that Hitler has toward Czechoslovakia, not for anything the Czechs did, but because, again, it is a physical, real manifestation of the Treaty of Versailles. This was created by the Treaty of Versailles, and he hates the Treaty of Versailles. He's going to wipe it off the map. Now, because Hitler is making these noises, he has his chief of staff of the army, Ludwig Beck. Okay. Now, we talked about how Walter von Brandis is the commander-in-chief of the army. Ludwig Beck is the chief of staff of the army. The chief of staff of the army. Not to be confused with Wilhelm Keitel, who's the chief of staff of OKW. He is the chief of staff of OKH, okay, the army. And Ludwig Beck, he's one of these kind of old-school German officers. Now, historically, in the Kaiserreich, and even before the Kaiserreich, remember the general staff was created during the Napoleonic Wars. And pretty much throughout the 19th century, right up through the Kaiserreich, the chief of staff of the army was like the highest-ranking, most important army officer in Germany. But then when they create the Republic, they create this next level of command, commander-in-chief of the army. So Ludwig Beck, he always wanted the chief of staff of the army to kind of regain its former glory. He wants it to have that. And he's kind of upset because, in fact, during his whole 10 years chief of staff of the army, he only meets with Hitler like twice. Now, under the Kaiserreich, the chief of staff of the army met with the Kaiser like every day, right? So he's kind of upset about that, and he feels this great army tradition has been degraded. Remember, this is from an organization that demanded its independence from the Weimar Republic, right? Anyway, so Ludwig Beck, the thing about Ludwig Beck is he is also a pretty smart guy, and he's kind of a realist. And he understands that if Hitler engages in this dangerous foreign policy with Czechoslovakia, kind of this brinksmanship with Britain and France, then sooner or later, we're going to have a war. Sooner or later, there will be a war with Britain and France. And he tells Hitler this. I mean, through memoranda and stuff. And he's convinced that Hitler, if he insists on this dangerous foreign policy, there will be a war. Well, Hitler just kind of ignores him. You know, as far as Hitler's concerned, he doesn't care what this guy has to say. And he's not a crony of Hitler the way von Brandis is, the way Blumberg had been, and Keitel is. These guys are just dance to Hitler's tune. And Ludwig Beck has a little bit more character than that. He's got a little bit more backbone than that. And so, because he is so convinced that Hitler and this reckless foreign policy could lead Germany to war, he decides he's going to resign. Now, this is, in any kind of government, when you have someone who's high-ranking and they disagree with the government's policy and they resign, that is a way of protesting it. Because if you're an army officer, even today in the United States Army, like for instance, do you remember here in maybe you don't. It's about 10 years ago when Obama was president, and Stanley McChrystal, who was general, he made comments about Obama in Rolling Stone. He's a serving general in Afghanistan. He's like a top-ranking general in Afghanistan, and he's saying like Obama is, and he's not doing a good job. He's criticizing the president. Obama relieved him and replaced him, as he should. You cannot have high-ranking military men, serving military men, criticize the government. You cannot do that. What McChrystal should have done was resigned and then criticized Obama. And he should have said, I resigned because I disagreed with what he was doing. That's how you do it. But a serving military officer cannot openly express, publicly express, disagreement with the political leadership. This cuts to the heart of, in our system, military being subordinate to the political. In the Korean War, Douglas MacArthur was bad-mouthing Truman in public and in the press. Truman had to relieve him, right? You could say the same thing about Abraham Lincoln and McClellan. But my point is, if for an army officer in any regime, you resign, that is your protest, and then you can say whatever you want. But while you are serving, you cannot criticize the government. But so what he does is he tells Hitler, I'm going to resign. I'm going to resign. Hitler now is kind of in a panic because he's trying to show this kind of unified German front against Britain and France. So he says to Beck, well, if you have to resign, I understand. But can you do me a favor? Will you not state the reasons? Will you just kind of go quietly and that way, and then I'll take care of you, and we'll make sure everything works out for you. But can you just resign quietly, and that way, because we're in these very tense negotiations with the West, we don't want anything to happen. And Beck stupidly says yes. I won't make a stink. The whole point of resigning is to protest what's going on, and yet for whatever reason he decides not to. Now whether he was bribed, which Hitler frequently did. Hitler bribed his generals. Whether he was bribed or threatened, who knows? But in any event, him resigning has no effect, right? You want him to. You would think he would want to make a stink about his own resignation, but he doesn't. And as we'll see, he's going to have a pretty nasty end in a few years. So over the summer, Henlein continues to agitate about the Sudetenland. And you have some German-inspired riots that take place in Prague and other cities. And then, of course, the Germans blame the Czechs for the violence, right? In September, the issue comes to a head. Hitler says, I can't sit back and I can't allow these German citizens to be treated so horribly by the Czech government and Czech people. I cannot allow it. And he's doing this because he's really starting to question just how strong is the specifically the French commitment to Czechoslovakia. How strong? Now the British, as I understand, the British don't have an alliance with Czechoslovakia, but they do have an alliance with France. So again, it's an alliance system, right? And Hitler is questioning how strong that alliance between France and Czechoslovakia really is. So it's starting to sound like Hitler might start a war. So the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, he says, we need to disarm this thing. We need to not have a war. So he gets the British or the French Premier, Edward Daladier, and they agree to go to meet with Hitler in September in Munich, Germany. This is actually the very first time in Neville Chamberlain's life he's ridden in an airplane. Is when he flies to Munich here. So in Britain, there had been for a few years, and it kind of comes to a head, this policy they call appeasement. Okay? Policy they call appeasement. And the policy of appeasement is this sense, you don't have this in France, because the French are scared to death of the Germans, but you have this sense in Britain. And you had the kernels of this pretty much almost as soon as the Treaty of Versailles is written. But then it's really starting to come to a head here in the late 30s. And it's this idea, this sense that Germany was treated too harshly by the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was treated too harshly. Now again, some people in Britain, including Lloyd George, expressed doubts almost immediately about the Treaty of Versailles, that it's too punitive. It's too punitive. And so in Britain, they kind of had this attitude when they're watching Germany get back on its feet under Hitler, when they're watching Germany take Austria and stuff, well, these things are alarming. There's also this sense of, well, you know, the Austrians obviously are for this. They want this. Germany probably does. This is probably the just thing to have happen. And also, too, there's a sense that we like the idea, as much as we may disagree with a lot of Hitler's social policies and whatever, and the way he treats the Jews, we like having this really, really powerful leader in the middle of Europe who is anti-communist. There is a sense among the British, Germany is a bulwark against communism. Germany is a bulwark against Soviet expansion, right? So there's that. But then, too, there's this idea of, you know, can we trust Hitler? Can we deal with Hitler? When Chamberlain goes to Munich, and this is why I think you need to be kind of a little bit of slack here. When Chamberlain goes to Munich, he's a politician. His finger's on the pulse of the British public. The British do not want war. Do not want war. So much so that in 1933, I can't remember the year, early mid-30s, the Oxford Debating Society, every year, Oxford University had this big debate. They'd have this big, great debate where they would debate some issue. They still have this. This still happens in Oxford debate. They'd have some big question that they would debate, and then they would decide from that debate who the winner is, and they would announce that, right? Well, that particular year, the Oxford Debating Society, the question they debated was, should Britain ever go to war again? Should Britain ever go to war? And I can't remember the exact wording, but what the resolution they create after that debate, what the resolution they created, and the people that said no won. It says, we resolve that these are young people, these are students, these are people that are going to fight in the next war potentially, right? And they have this resolution that says, we will not fight for Britain under any circumstances. We will not fight for our country under any circumstances. This is reflective of the feelings of a lot of people, probably the majority of students throughout England, the people that you'll need to fight. So Chamberlain knows if he comes back from Munich saying there's going to be a war, guess what's going to happen to him? They'll vote him out of power. And there still won't be a war anyway. And Britain will come away looking weaker than it had before. Chamberlain knows this. He knows the people of Britain do not want to fight a war. Now, he genuinely wants peace, which is always a good and noble goal. He wants peace, but he's a politician, and he knows what he can and can't do realistically. And he simply could not have come back from Munich saying we're going to war. He just couldn't have done that and survive politically and have his country still have the prestige and standing that it had previously here. So he's got to find a way to avoid a war. He's got to find a way to avoid a war here. Now, as you say, when they go to this conference, they don't invite any Czech representatives, and they don't invite the Soviets, and Stalin was really upset. Stalin thought he should have a say in this. Nobody else did, but Stalin thought he should have a say in it. Yeah, okay, so the motion, the Oxford Resolution motion, the actual wording was, the House will under no circumstances fight for its king and country. The motion passed 275 to 153. 275 to 153. And I should point out, even in the most radical days of the American experience in the Vietnam War, nobody was saying, we will not fight for America under any circumstances. They were saying, we should get out of Vietnam. This war is not good. But people weren't saying loudly, we will not fight for this country under any circumstances. Chamberlain He actually went on British radio on September 27th. Chamberlain goes on British radio on September 27th, and he says, quote, "How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing." So he's kind of trying to distance himself from any sense of responsibility, and you can debate to what extent the Western Allies had a responsibility here. But he's trying to distance himself and justify to the British people why that's the case. He goes on to say that, quote, "However much we may sympathize with a small nation confronted by a big, powerful neighbor, we cannot in all circumstances undertake to involve the whole British Empire in war on her account." So again, he's kind of letting the British people know, we're not going to go to war. It's not going to happen. We're not going to go to war. Well, this is great for British consumption, but it's lousy for your diplomatic hand, right? Because if you're telling your own people we're not going to go to war, you're not going to go to war, Hitler's thinking, guess what? He's not going to go to war. I can get away with anything. Yeah. Bad actors have to know there's consequences. If Putin had the slightest inkling of what was going to happen to him when he went into Ukraine, he wouldn't have gone into Ukraine, right? So it's that threat of force that keeps bad actors from acting. And when you tell that bad actor, hey, we're not going to do anything, bad stuff happens. I mean, arguably, after Vietnam, Jimmy Carter said, we're not going to use the military anymore. We're not going to get involved in these foreign adventures. We're not going to do these things. 2 years later, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. Now, I'm not saying there's a direct correlation there, but I'm saying you can't ignore the possibility, right? Bad actors do bad things if they think they can get away with it. So they meet on 29 September. At the meeting, we've got Chamberlain, Dallier, Mussolini, and Hitler. Chamberlain, Dallier, Mussolini, and Hitler. They go, they have this conference in Munich, and eventually what is agreed here is essentially France will not honor its treaty commitments with Czechoslovakia. France will not honor its treaty commitments with Czechoslovakia. Now, here's the thing. This is a bargain. They're making a deal here, okay? The deal that they make is Hitler says, if you give me the Sudetenland, you allow me to move in the Sudetenland without a war, I promise I will make no more territorial demands in Europe. I will make no more territorial demands in Europe. I will ask for nothing else. You give me that. So they say, okay. That's the deal. Before Chamberlain returns to England, he spends the night in Munich, and before he returns to England the next day, he has breakfast with Hitler. And he says, Herr Hitler, I wonder if you would just sign this paper for me. And the paper wasn't a big diplomatic thing. It was not written by the British Foreign Ministry. It was just a little paper that Neville Chamberlain wrote. And it just said something to the effect of, I, Adolf Hitler, promise I will not start a war. I will not look for anything else in Europe. And he says, will you just sign this so I can show the British people that you're sincere? And Hitler says, sure. So Hitler signs it for him. Chamberlain then, they sign this Munich Pact. He signs Chamberlain's little paper afterward. And then he returns to, you can see Ribbentrop right there. He returns to London. He gets off the plane. He waves that piece of paper that Hitler just signed that morning, and he says, I believe this is peace in our time. Peace in our time. The Czechs, of course, are left hanging. They're essentially told, you can fight the Germans if you want to, but you're not getting any help from us. The Czechs knew they didn't have a prayer to stand up to Hitler without Western support. So Hitler takes over the Sudetenland. He gets his way, and now that mountainous defensive country is in German hands, and if a war were to break out with Czechoslovakia, the Germans could easily overrun the rump of Czechoslovakia. Winston Churchill. This time, Winston Churchill is he's Minister of Parliament, but he's not sitting in the government. He doesn't have a seat in government. He's just a backbencher in Parliament. And he gets up and he gives a speech shortly after the Munich Pact in the House of Commons. And he says, quote, "We have suffered a total and unmitigated defeat." And then later, he would write a letter to David Lloyd George, who was one of the orchestrators of the Treaty of Versailles. He's still kicking. Churchill writes a letter to him and he says, quote, "England has been offered a choice between war and shame. She has chosen shame and will get war." So Churchill's saying, in fact, in his memoirs, he writes, he says, "We were in a much better position to fight Germany in 1938, before the Munich Pact, than we were a year later over Poland. And if we'd gone to war here, it's entirely possible it would have been easier to win a war against Germany." Now, it's a what if, it's a counterfactual, who knows, but undoubtedly they were in a better military position in 1938 than they would have been in 1939, at least from the strategic standpoint of the ground. However, to counter that, you could say Britain had lost air parity a few years earlier, and some people have suggested, I've heard it suggested, that Neville Chamberlain knew this, and he was just trying to postpone a war to give English factories enough time to produce more aircraft to fight the war. Who knows? Who knows? Now, in Germany, Hitler's popularity is through the roof. He did it again. Hitler did it again. He was able to beat the odds. He gambled, and he won. He got us all this territory without a war. So Hitler, of course, is riding high. Okay, now we have something in Germany that's going to happen at this time that's very disturbing. And this has to do with the Polish border refugee crisis. It starts here. Essentially, what happens is there were a number of Polish Jews living in Germany, and by 1938, the German government decides, you don't belong in Germany, you need to go back to Poland. So they move them to the border of Poland. They take these Jews, these Polish Jews, to the border of Poland. The problem is, by this point, the Polish government is this right-wing authoritarian government. Again, I wouldn't call it fascist, but it's this right-wing authoritarian government. And they don't want the Jews back. The Polish government does not want these Jews back. So what they do is they set up, essentially, refugee camps along the border. So these Polish Jews are in Germany, on the German side of the border. They're living in these camps in squalid conditions. There's not, good access to water. There's not, a lot of food and medical supplies. They're living in a very poor place. And by November of 1938, winter is coming. Things are going to get a lot worse. Okay, people are going to die, right? So things are not going too well here. Well, it just so happens that in Paris, we've got this guy here, Herschel Grynszpan. Herschel Grynszpan. Grynszpan is a student in Paris. Living in Paris as a student. His parents are in this camp, are in one of these camps on the border, okay? They're Polish Jews, and they're being forced back there. He's mad. This kid, and he's like 18 years old, he is pissed. He's mad at the Germans for expelling them from Germany. He blames the Germans. He is madder than sin. And he's a hothead. So one day, he gets a gun, and he gets the idea he's going to kill the German ambassador to France. He's going to kill the German ambassador to France. Well, he walks into the German embassy, and they ask, how can we help you? And he says, I need to see the ambassador. Well, the ambassador is a pretty important fellow, and this is just some kid off the street. So they say, well, why don't we have you talk with one of our, secretaries, and he can see if this is worthy for the ambassador to look at. So he goes in to see this German secretary. He's like a third or fourth secretary, kind of a mid-level bureaucrat here in the embassy. And he goes in to see Ernst von Rath. And Ernst von Rath asks what he can do for him. And Grynszpan, by this point, realizes he's not going to get in to see the ambassador. So he pulls out his gun and he shoots von Rath. And he kills von Rath. I can't remember how. I think it was like maybe the next day he died. I can't remember exactly how long it took him to die, but he kills von Rath. He shoots him dead. And then, of course, he's Vespasian is arrested. Now, it's going to be ironic because a few years later, one of the things the Gestapo will do, particularly after the war begins, is the Gestapo wants to recruit officers that have a special hatred toward Jews. They really like that. They really like if they think they've been slighted by Jews or something. They always ask them, well, why don't you like Jews? And they tell them their stories. So they actually end up giving a job to von Rath's father because, of course, his son was killed by a Jew, and he must have a special hatred toward Jews. That's the Nazi thinking, right? So von Rath's father actually becomes a member of the Gestapo during the war, and he helps Jews escape. He uses his position to help Jews to freedom. He did not blame the Jews for that. Anyway, this has major, major consequences back in the Reich. We have the beginning of Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht. The night of broken glass. And I'm not going to get too much into it. I'll just suffice it to say, Joseph Goebbels was not in favor with Hitler. Joseph Goebbels' wife, Magda Goebbels, kind of acted almost like an ersatz first lady of Germany since Hitler wasn't married. Hitler really liked Magda Goebbels, and Goebbels wanted to get divorced from her. He was having an affair with a Czech film actress, and Hitler was not happy about the whole thing. So Goebbels was trying to get back into the good graces of Hitler. And so what he does is he orchestrates this kind of, when he hears about what happens to von Rath, he'd been trying to think of something to get back into Hitler's good graces. So what he does is he essentially orchestrates this big propaganda thing. Look at what the Jews are doing. The Jews are killing us. They shot this German officer who was just doing his job. He wasn't hurting anybody, and this Jew shot him. It's time we teach the Jews here in Germany a lesson, right? So he stirs up, he whips up the people. He orders SA and SS units to put on civilian clothing, to get rid of their uniforms, put on civilian clothing, and start beating up Jews, start burning their homes, their businesses. And because they want this to look like it's a spontaneous uprising of the people. They don't want this to look like it's a government action against the Jews. They want it to look like it's just the people get so angry and fed up with the Jews that they do it. That they cause these pogroms here. But as soon as this begins, I mean, Jews are being dragged out in the street and beaten. Like I say, shops are being looted and destroyed. It's called broken glass because of all the shop windows that are smashed here and the glass in the street. But of course, the government's really pulling the strings. The fire brigades were ordered in the cities only take out fires if they're burning non-Jewish shops and businesses. Which is easier said than done, because you can't just look at a shop and see if it's owned by a German or a Jew, right? But that's what the instructions they're giving. If it's a synagogue, let it burn. If it's a synagogue, let it burn. There's other just horrible, horrible things that they're doing. I know there's one instance where a bunch of Jews broke into a synagogue, and there was an elderly rabbi, and they started beating him, and they told him they'd stop beating him if he defecated on the Torah. I'm just, why in the name of God would you do something like that? So this kind of stuff is just common, and it's going on all over Germany, in cities and towns throughout Germany. About 7,500 Jewish shops were destroyed over about 2 nights here. About 7,500 Jewish shops were destroyed. 267 synagogues were burned. 267 synagogues were burned. The police arrest that night, well, a couple of nights here, they arrest about 20,000 Jews. 20,000 Jews. And again, just because they're Jews, right? Now, before, you'd seen a lot of people going to concentration camps, not necessarily just because they were Jews. Maybe they were communists or trade unionists, or they'd done something to piss people off. But you don't have, like, the government arresting people just because they're Jewish en masse like this. Now you do. You do have this. 91 Jews, at least 91 Jews were outright murdered throughout Germany. At least 91 Jews were outright murdered. Shortly after this, for the next few weeks, you have waves of Jewish suicides. Waves of Jewish suicides. Some people estimate perhaps as many as 638 Jewish people over the next few weeks take their own lives. 638. Despite the attempts of the regime to make this look like it was this grassroots thing, it's very obvious to foreigners this was orchestrated from above. This was orchestrated from above. Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, he famously said, quote, "I myself could scarcely believe that such things could occur in the 20th century." I myself could scarcely believe that such things could occur in the 20th century. Hermann Goering had not been involved in this. He'd not been planning. He kind of took him by surprise, too. He hadn't been notified about it. And he's horrified. Hermann Goering is kind of horrified. Now, he's not horrified because of what's happening to the Jews. He has no love for Jews. Goering was never the rabid anti-Semite that, say, someone like Goebbels was. But at the same time, if Hitler tells him to kill Jews, he's got no problem killing Jews. I mean, he's got no problem with it. But he's just not somebody that necessarily had the same passion for it that, say, a Goebbels or a Himmler had. But nevertheless, Goering is horrified. Doesn't care about the Jews. Why do you think someone like Goering would just objectively look at what's happening over Germany and be horrified? What particular aspect of this program do you think he's upset about? Now remember, Goering wears a lot of hats, right? He wears a lot of hats. One of his hats was he was the head of what they called the 4-year plan, which was an economic way to build up Germany, okay? So the towns are being wrecked. How is that specifically going to hurt the economy? Let me put it this way. What particular industry is going to be affected by what's going on here? Insurance. All of these Jewish shops were insured. The synagogues were insured. All of this is insured. This is going to ruin the insurance industry in Germany. It's going to ruin the insurance industry. Germany announces, or the German insurance company announces, with all these claims that are being filed, we're going to go bankrupt. We're going to go bankrupt. So of course the government has to intervene to figure this out. So with Hitler's approval, Goering meets with government, business leaders, insurance leaders on November 12th. He meets with all these leaders on November 12th. And they decide, well, now wait a second. We might be able to kill two birds with one stone here. We're trying to get Jews to leave Germany. We want the Jews to leave. Maybe if we just continue to make it economically unbearable for Jews to stay, they'll leave of their own accord. So here's what they come up with. They issue a series of decrees. And I'm not going to attempt the German there. But this is called the Jewish Capital Levy. The Jewish Capital Levy. Essentially what they say is, who is responsible for these riots? The Jews. It was a Jew that killed a German in Paris. The Jews are responsible for these riots. Because the Jews are responsible, the Jewish community in Germany must pay for all the damages. They must pay for all the damages. So the figure that the Reich's government comes to is 1 billion Reichsmarks. 1 billion Reichsmarks. So the insurance companies are off the hook. They don't have to pay a dime. And the Jews have to pay the government 1 billion Reichsmarks to pay for this. Certainly some government services are cleaning up streets and stuff like that, and that was kind of the excuse. Well, we Germans are cleaning up the mess. You've got to pay for it. You also have new laws that are also passed at this time, which deeply affect Jews and what professions Jews can belong to. They are no longer they're no longer allowed to operate as independent craftsmen. So if you're something like a carpenter or a builder or something, and you own your own business, or you just work out of your house, you can't do it. You would have to work under another business. You'd have to work for someone else. Jews are no longer to hold managerial positions in larger businesses. They're not allowed to hold managerial positions in larger businesses. Jews that own businesses that import or export items, could not do that anymore. You were then forced to sell your business to an Aryan company. This is an Aryanization of business. And this has been part of the 4-year plan to a smaller extent. Now it's really kicking into high gear. And you're forced to sell to Aryans at outrageous prices, like 10 cents on the dollar in some cases. So these vast commercial enterprises that people, families have been working on for years and years and years, they're sold to, have to be sold to Aryans. Now I want to talk a little bit too. One thing that's going to happen here is Jews will also be, under these laws, Jews will be forbidden to own firearms. Jew will no longer be able to own a gun under these laws. Now I want to talk a little bit about gun control in Germany. Not a lot of people owned handguns in Germany, okay? A lot of people owned rifles for hunting, but if you wanted to own a handgun or carry a handgun, there were really only 3 kinds of people going back through the Kaiserreich that could own a gun, could carry a gun in Germany. If you got a special license from the government, you could, but you had to prove you needed it. So like private detectives and stuff, they would usually apply and they'd usually get them. If you worked for the government in any capacity, if you worked for the German federal government, you could carry a gun. If you worked for the railroads, you could carry a gun. You were allowed to carry a gun if you worked for the railroads. And then when the Nazis come to power, they had a 4th category. When the Nazis come to power, if you are a member of the Nazi Party, if you are an NSDAP member, you can carry a gun legally. So you didn't have widespread gun ownership in Germany to begin with. But now, any firearm, even a hunting rifle, Jews are not allowed to own. Okay, they're being disarmed here. Jews are required to pay even additional taxes at extraordinary rates. They're required to pay more than their German Aryan neighbors. And then, of course, one of the big unspoken levies that's placed on Jews is frequently, in order to get all this stuff done, you want to get any business done, you want to sell your business, you want to get into a new job or something, almost across the board, you can count on paying somebody under the table. You've got to bribe people. You've got to bribe people in order to get stuff done. But there was something where a guy, I can't remember what he wanted, but this Jewish guy goes for a German bureaucrat and he says, I need permits for this and that and that. And the German says, okay, well, that's good. Yeah, we can do that here. So the Jewish guy says, what do you want? What do I have to get? He says, well, I'll let you know. Night or two later, guy's eating dinner. This Nazi shows up at his house and says, this store over on dinner, they got these really nice rugs. I really like a rug. Okay. So the Jew goes, he buys this really expensive rug, gives it to the German. The German says, okay, permit approved. That's how business, that's how government is working in Nazi Germany at this time. Now, Hitler arguably makes a miscalculation here with his next move. In March of 1939, in violation of the Munich Pact of the previous September, 6 months earlier, Hitler invades the rump of Czechoslovakia. Now, what he does is he moves into the Czech part here. So this is the Sudetenland that he had taken in September, and then in March he takes over the rest of it. The Czechs can't defend themselves because they've lost their defensive perimeter with those mountains, right? So very easily the Czechs move in, or the Germans move into this, and they take over the Czech part. They say to the Slovaks, you can have your own country. You can be independent. So they create an independent Slovakia. Meanwhile, this Czech part is renamed the Reichsprotectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. The Reichsprotectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Incidentally, there's a great Czech film that came out, 10, 15 years ago called I Served the King of England. Has anybody ever seen that? It's a really good show, but it's almost this cartoon about this Czech guy who he wants to be rich and famous. That's all he wants. Well, he wants to be rich. He wants to be rich. And it's just kind of how, in the interwar years, how he just tries to do all these things to get rich and becomes a waiter and all these, just this kind of little short, not great-looking guy, but women just go crazy. He's kind of telling the story. And anyway, he's here. He actually marries this girl who is an ethnic German. And because he's got blonde hair, the Nazis say, oh, yeah, you can be part of our racial community. You can marry this German girl. And he's really happy, and he doesn't care about politics. And meanwhile, of course, the Germans come in, and everybody hates him because he's married to this German. But it's interspersed, and it's like I say, it's bright and it's colorful. It's like a cartoon. But then it's interspersed with him after World War II, and he's an old man, and it's shot very realistically, and life is hard. Communists are running Czechoslovakia at this time. But then it cuts back to this like cartoon of him remembering his life, and it's a really, really good film. He works in this restaurant, the maitre d'. He knows everything. Everybody asks the maitre d' a question, he can tell them. And so one day he says, how come you know everything? And the maitre d' says, I served the King of England. And that was his answer, because he'd served the King of England. He knows everything. But anyway, it's a great film. If you get a chance, check it out. Britain and France are outraged. Now here's the thing. When Hitler took over Austria, and then when he took over the Sudetenland, Hitler was doing this on the basis of a very important notion. These are ethnic Germans. I'm reuniting ethnic Germans. I'm bringing ethnic Germans into the Reich. But when he goes here, these are not ethnic Germans. These are Czechs. These are Slavs. They're not ethnic Germans. So suddenly, Hitler is kind of exposed. He shows the world, I'm interested in just territory and power, and I'm using this whole kind of racial thing, German ethnic racial thing, as an excuse to conquer, right? So when the British and the French see this, they're just outraged. They're absolutely outraged. So right there, instantly, and then it's not just the governments, particularly the British people, are saying to themselves, we can't trust this guy. He made an agreement at Munich, he broke it. He's going after these people, they're not ethnically German, we can't trust him, you can't deal with him. So there's an important kind of psychological shift that occurs when Hitler makes this move. Okay? The British are unwilling to work with him after that. They're unwilling to believe him after that. Hitler then starts making noises about the Polish corridor. Again, Treaty of Versailles created this to give the Poles access to the sea. Danzig, the city there, Danzig, was actually a free city administered by the League of Nations, but the people that were actually physically running it were Poles. Okay, they were actually physically there. The bureaucracy was Polish. But as you can see, it cuts East Prussia off from Germany proper, and there was no road or rail access. If you wanted to go from East Prussia to Germany, you had to go via the Baltic Sea. You couldn't just cross the corridor there. At least military units couldn't cross, or government stuff couldn't cross officially. So Hitler starts to demand in early 1939, right after he takes over Czechoslovakia, he says, we want a return of the Polish corridor. We want a return of the Polish corridor. The Poles say, no, we're not going to give it to you. This is Polish territory. And London and Paris both issue guarantees to Poland. If Hitler attempts force to take back the Polish corridor, we will defend you. We will come to your aid. We will come to your aid. So Hitler now walks back a little bit, and he says, okay, here's what we'll do. You can keep the corridor, you can keep Danzig, but you have to allow us to have road and rail access through the corridor to East Prussia, so we can move whatever we want to move back and forth. And then there's some other demands they put on it. They demanded that they start putting some of their hand-picked people into the Polish government to look out for their interests. So essentially, if the Poles give into this, they are subordinating themselves to Germany. They're almost making Poland a satellite country of Germany. and the Poles wanted their independence. The Poles did not want to sacrifice any bit of their independence and their sovereignty. They don't want to sacrifice any of their sovereignty. So before long, guess what Hitler pulls out? What story Hitler pulls out? Ethnic Germans are being abused by Poles. I need to help them. I alone can help them. By this time, the British and the French really don't have much of a stomach for these German lies, for Hitler's lies at this point. So now it's starting to get real. So the British and the French say, well, look, as much as we hate the Soviets, as much as we hate communism, maybe we should talk to the Soviets. So they dispatch a ship, a slow ship from London to the Soviet Union to begin negotiations with the Soviets for essentially an anti-German pact. So now the British are more afraid of the Germans than they are of the Soviets. However, Stalin is kind of offended. These guys did not fly to Moscow right away. They took this slow ship, and all of the people in the delegations, all the diplomats in the British-French delegations, they're not like foreign secretaries. They're not like top guys in government. These are like mid-level bureaucrats. So Stalin is really offended that they're sending these kind of mid-level guys instead of their top guys. Now, as Stalin's diplomats are engaging with these British and French diplomats over the summer of 1939, he is also secretly meeting. Hitler decides to send his representative to meet with the Germans, or to meet with the Soviets. So Hitler starts secretly negotiating with the Soviets. Hitler and the Soviets hate each other's guts. They hate each other's guts, and yet now they're talking. After Hitler had gone into Bohemia and Moravia, there's a weapons plant here called the Skoda Works. And the Skoda Works actually had contracts for weapons for the Soviet Union. And so right after this happened, the Soviets actually asked the German government, are you going to fulfill these contracts? They've taken our money, are you going to fulfill these contracts? And it kind of surprised the Soviets when the Germans said, yeah, we'll fulfill them. Yeah, we will. Hitler's sending a message. Maybe we can find some common ground here. Okay? So by the summer, he sent his foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop. He's meeting with the Soviet foreign commissar, Molotov. So these two guys, Molotov and Ribbentrop, they work out a deal. On August 23rd, 1939, they create what was known as the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. It's sometimes called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. You can see Molotov there. That's Ribbentrop. Stalin's there. Boris Shapishnikov's right there. They're signing this document. Now, this Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact essentially, on one hand, is a trade agreement. It's a trade agreement. The Nazis need raw materials. They need oil. They need metals. They need food. And the Soviets have got all these things in abundance. They're going to go ahead and sell these things to the Germans. In exchange, and these are things that immediately the Germans are going to get. Okay? In exchange, the Germans give the Soviets plans to build power plants, to build a battleship. They give them these like blueprints and technology, stuff that will take the Soviets a while to develop. So the Germans are immediately getting resources. The Soviets are getting kind of the promise of future rewards here, right? So it's really a technology for resources deal is primarily how this works here. But there's also a secret protocol. There's a secret protocol. And the secret protocol is they're going to cut Poland right down the middle. The Germans will invade from the west, the Soviets from the east, and they each get a chunk. Okay? And more than that, the Germans tell the Soviets, if you want to invade some of these Baltic countries, go ahead. There was a big section of Romania that the Soviet Union wanted called Bessarabia. Go ahead, take it. Do what you need to do with Finland. Go ahead. The Germans are cool. Essentially, Stalin's looking at the British and the French. What do you have to offer? I mean, they really can't give him anything. But then he looks to Hitler, and Hitler's saying, hey, take what you want. I don't care. We'll find a common border, and then you can have whatever you want. So Stalin's thinking, Hitler's making a lot of sense. And what's more, they're both gangsters. They're both totalitarian leaders. They kind of speak the same language. They kind of both know what each other's talking about. They announced this on August 23rd, 1939. They announced the non-aggression pact on August 23rd. And it stuns the world. Many communists throughout the world, particularly here in the United States, say, I'm done with Stalin. If he's making a deal with Hitler, I don't want anything more to do with him. A lot of communists resign from the communist parties around the world because they think Stalin just betrayed the communist revolution. Okay? But, of course, as soon as this is announced, Britain and France both have a Maalox moment. Oh, crap. What are we going to do now? Right? So, they're pretty scared here. Well, so Hitler's now is going to go ahead with the invasion of Poland. And some people are saying, well, what about Britain and France? And he said, I saw them at Munich. They were worms. And Ribbentrop, who's supposed to be an expert on England, is saying, they'll do nothing. They won't do anything. So Hitler's convinced he has neutralized the threat in the West by making a deal in the East. He'll be able to take over Poland. He needs now a casus belli. So he has a false flag operation. This is sometimes it's called Operation Himmler. Sometimes it's called Operation Canned Goods. The canned goods were concentration camp inmates. They take them out to Gleiwitz. They shoot them. They put them in Polish uniforms, and they say the Poles are actually attacking this radio station at Gleiwitz on the border and broadcasting anti-Polish or anti-German propaganda. They've invaded us first. And this is their casus belli. When the Red Cross actually comes to examine this, because they're inviting journalists and Red Cross people to examine, look, these are Poles. And they came over. Look, they got Polish uniforms. They got Polish paybooks. It was kind of weird because they were all shot, but there were no bullet holes in their uniforms. So, weird. Anyway, so this is Hitler's casus belli. And on September 1st, 1939, the Germans invade Poland. Germans invade Poland. This is considered to be the beginning of the Second World War. September 1st, 1939, the Germans invade Poland.